Welcome to the Decent People Podcast, a production of Decential Media, where we're committed to telling the stories of the founders, builders, and visionaries who are creating a new decentralized economy and internet experience. You guys know it as Web3 or blockchain, but we're going to bring you the smartest and most interesting people in the space for intimate conversations that reveal their background, how they got into crypto in the first place, and what they're doing today to make a decentralized future a reality. Thanks so much for joining us, and check out our site at Decential.io. Now to the show. Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Decent People Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Leising, and today we are joined by Austin Federer. He is head of comms for the Solana blockchain. It's one of the biggest Ethereum competitors. It's very fast and very cheap, amazingly high-tech blockchain. So I'm really excited to talk to Austin about that. Hey, Austin, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, welcome to the show. So I'd love to know, I like to just dive into people and like their backgrounds and stuff. So I'd love to hear about, like where you grew up and I noticed that there was a little bit of journalism in your background, a little bit of politics. So I'd love to hear kind of where you kind of were coming from on that end.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty atypical journey into this Web3 and crypto crazy space that we all exist and live in now. So I grew up in Western Massachusetts, around Amherst and sort of the towns around there. So very sort of like small town New England. Like there's, it's like called the 5 colleges area. There's like 5 colleges within like 6 miles of each other.
I've got a good friend who lives right there. Yeah, it's a beautiful spot.
It's a lovely part of the country. It's a little sleepy, but it's a really nice part of the country. And so I grew up around there. My dad was a professor at Mount Holyoke. He taught criminology and sociology for a bunch of years. My mom did a bunch of management consulting and worked at Ernst & Young and a bunch of those type of places. I would say for me, like coming out of high school, I was like, I don't really know what I want to do. There was a lot of areas I was sort of interested in, but nothing that really felt super strong. And I went to Lawrence University for college out in like Appleton, Wisconsin, which is a small liberal arts school in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. But it was great. It was like a very academic environment. It was, one of these like schools that was kind of so underfunded that you just could do anything. And the professors were just completely engaged. So like I had like a crazy student job, which was like running the student tech production for like all these, like they built a brand new campus center and like didn't have any money to hire anyone to run the thing. And so like had me running like all the lighting and sound for like all these like crazy touring shows that would come through. And like, that was just like the vibe of the place. Like, my freshman year, this other student and I will, just put together a grant to like get a bunch of solar panels and put them on the roof of one of the buildings. And the facilities guys were like, sure, sounds good. Cool. But it was one of those like crazy experiences that in retrospect, like it feels super Web3. Like there kind of just weren't enough adults in the building to say the normal things like, no, you can't just apply for a grant for solar panels yourself. You probably have to go through some like formal committee to do this thing. But just folks weren't, everyone was just like doing their own thing. And so that was a really fun place to spend 4 years.
Yeah, that's great. It's like a DIY college. Yeah. I love that.
Totally. Yeah.
And we'll get back to Appleton, but first, like, did you have brothers and sisters growing up?
No, it's just me. I think there was always some plans for siblings, and for some reason they never worked out. So it just ended up being me.
What were you into as a kid? Did you like, school, sports? What if I ran into you in your high school hall, what would you have been talking about at that point?
Oh man, high school was a funny time for me. The hilarious, in most schools, like football is like the big thing. But this being Amherst and kind of a hippie part of Western Massachusetts, it was ultimate frisbee. That was like the big sport that everyone was like, oh yeah, the ultimate team's great. Like we had one of the best men's teams in the country, one of the best women's teams in the country. I played for a bunch on sort of like the JV team, which is hilarious when you think about there were actually there's a a varsity team and then two different JV teams, which is crazy when you think about that. There was enough people excited about ultimate frisbee that there were three teams, and then there were, I think, two women's teams as well. So
this is not crazy to me at all, because I went to UC Santa Barbara, and if you know,
all right, there you go.
Ultimate Frisbee, they are like one of the best teams in the country too. So, and
there you go.
Yeah, I knew a couple players, and they took it very seriously. It's a good sport. Definitely a hippie sport though, and there might be
definitely
some hacky sack
sport
involved somewhere along the periphery, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun because it's like soccer without all the like drama. Like there's something really, really nice about like how much you're running and how much of a team sport it is that I really enjoyed it. But I did a lot of work in the theater department too. I was never like anyone interested in being on stage, but like lighting and sound design for shows was something I got really into. I did a bunch of like photography for student productions and that sort of thing. Yeah. And because, there's so many great like colleges around there, and just like a lot of folks kind of get in the art world seem to get burnt out from New York, at least at that time, and move out to places like Western Massachusetts. So there was always a really good collection of like very talented people who were just trying to do shows and do cool things. So, as a high schooler, I got to work with, a bunch of really fantastic theater producers too, who were just like doing something in like the Berkshires for the summer or something along those lines. And so I did a lot of that stuff in high school too.
Yeah, that's great. And then I noticed you kind of jumped right out of college into marketing, but it was for like a radio station, I believe, first. And then you were at the Boston Globe with online, digital sort of media for them.
Yeah. So undergraduate, I did political science and environmental studies, and I spent a lot of that work on international transboundary water resource management treaties. That was just something I was particularly excited about and interested in, was sort of like, how do you develop social and technical compliance mechanisms in like the Indus River Treaty between India and Pakistan, or Article 40 of the Oslo Accords between like Israel and Palestine, and sort of why that Israel-Palestine agreement has been so unsuccessful. And like Palestine's like one of the most water-starved places in the world. Israel's not. There's a whole bunch of treaty mechanisms there that made that relationship difficult. Whereas India and Pakistan, two countries that have fought, 3 semi-wars between each other since the treaty was enacted, but neither one's ever turned off the water, bombed a dam. There's a whole bunch of really interesting dynamics there that made those two pieces of sort of treaty compliance really interesting to me. So going out of college, I thought about doing a PhD. There's a guy, Aaron Wolf, at I think the University of Oregon, who's like one of the world experts in this stuff. I looked at the potential of going in and doing a PhD program. And what I decided for myself was like, I wanted to do things that were going to have more tangible world impact. I would be going and like downloading these journals, articles, and you could see the little download counts there. And it'd be like this seminal paper that everyone thinks is like the most important thing in the industry. And it's like 135 downloads in the last year. And you're just like, that's how few people are reading this stuff. Yeah. Like I wanted to do something that felt a little bit more impact. And I'd always had an interest in journalism. And so went to, actually, it's funny. I got an internship out of college at the NPR show On Point, which at that point was hosted by Tom Ashbrook and was based out in Boston. And so I had one of those classic public radio unpaid internships for about 6 months there, helping sort of do the grunt work of producing a show, calling and booking guests. Like this is back in the days when they were like, what are people saying on Twitter? And so I'd like go through the Twitter comments and the online comments and like pull insightful ones and run them into the studio and, all that like very low level journalism internship work. And kind of really enjoyed that process of like, as naive as it sounds maybe now, like sort of helping facilitate a conversation to help people figure out what they think about things going on in the world. And then so from there
Does that go back, do you think, on the treaty stuff? Like, was it the diplomacy part of it that kind of intrigued you, or what was? Because it's kind of such an esoteric kind of corner of the world. What was it that snagged you into that sort of? I know you didn't go very far in that direction, but what was it initially that kind of brought you in?
I think there's like. I don't know who said, there's someone who said this, there's like two kinds of like millennials, the group who grew up watching The West Wing and the group who grew up watching 24. And those like shape the view of your world. Either like the world is potentially trying to kill you and you need to be the strong man who's like the only person protecting America, or like fundamentally people can come together in large groups and they can do work for good that'll improve the lives of everyone. And I definitely fall into that latter camp. And like still to this day, like I think I can, if I'm honest and open with folks on Twitter, I can convince them that maybe they're seeing something in the wrong way. And like, who knows how true that is, but that is like very much how I like approach my world and how I think about this stuff. So like that role from like treaties and international water management into journalism, especially kind of in this was like 2013, 2014, felt pretty organic and felt pretty genuine at that point, where this was kind of before we were aware of, or at least before it had really come onto the scene, this idea of like really strong, overtly deceptive media, which obviously we're inundated with now. But this was kind of before folks were kind of aware of that stuff. It was something I was thinking was largely still going on just on the periphery. And so that felt like a really interesting place to be. So I took a job at KBIA, which is this public radio station in Columbia, Missouri. It's actually owned by the Missouri School of Journalism. Got paid a whopping $28,000 a year. Moved down there and just ran digital content for them for about a year and a half, which was a really great experience.
Yeah, at least you were in Missouri for that 28 grand. That probably goes a little bit further than New York or San Francisco.
No, I had a lovely, beautiful apartment that was like $500 a month, like right downtown, walk to work. Like that part of it was really nice.
Yeah. And that's one of the best journalism schools in the country at Missouri there. Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was another like example of just getting able to learn from really excellent people. And, ironically, I don't think I learned much about journalism. I actually still to this day think like a journalism degree is like questionable.
Yeah.
I think like largely what you need to do is learn how to think and learn how to like process management stuff. And that feels to be like the value of a liberal arts education for me. I say the same thing to folks being like, should I go to school for like something to get into Web3? And I'm like, if you're going to college and want to do something in Web3, like go and learn how to think. Don't go and like learn how to like do computer science. You can teach yourself that nowadays. But there's very few places you can still learn that well.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with you on that. I went to Berkeley as a graduate school of journalism, and I don't think the program itself helped me very much, but my fellow students were amazing. I learned a lot from them, and getting access to the teachers and the professors that I had was probably the best part of what that 2 years brought me. Yeah. So
it's the experience of like learning how to learn about learning that like I have found the most useful thing in carrying me through the rest of my career.
Yeah. I'm definitely coming around to the idea that not everybody needs to go to college. They just need to learn to think for themselves. So we'll see.
And for probably 200 years, college has been the best way to learn that, but maybe it's not anymore.
Right. And I say that as somebody with two kids that are rapidly approaching college age. So it might just be self-interest. Yeah. And then, so how did you make your way to the Boston Globe?
So there's a woman I was working with at NPR who was like a product manager there. And she actually like was a bit of a mentor to me back in the early days. Not as much for journalism, but like how to think about process and how to think about technology. And she took a job at the Globe and she was like, hey, you should come over here. We're trying to rebuild the Boston Globe and make it a modern journalistic organization. And like, there's a new guy who'd come in, the managing editor of Digital and a bunch of these folks. And they sort of were like, yeah, we'll take a shot on like a 23-year-old to like come and run social for us. And moved over to Boston, like got to work with like a bunch of the investigative reporters on teams. But it's a classic thing where you take a job that's supposed to be innovative at a big old company and you're like, oh, like 20% of the company is on board with this and 30% is dead set against it and 50% just doesn't care. And so it was a really rough job, like trying to convince people like, we don't have to tweet everything that comes out. We have to stop chasing the clicks and page views. Like, and in some ways, like one of the fascinating parts about working there was like that firewall between editorial and business, which really should exist on a huge number of areas in journalism. was incredibly detrimental to actually like when an organization was failing on revenue and failing on journalism. Like how do you actually fix that problem when you're not allowed to have both sides talk to each other? And that was a really, really like the thing I really learned there is like almost how organizations fail. There were a few like very high profile non-journalism failures of the Globe in the 6 months while I was there that were fascinating in retrospect to think about and look at. And so I learned a ton there, but
remind us of one or two of those.
Yeah. So one of the really like kind of very silly ones is like the logistics operations center decided they were going to switch delivery companies that like delivered the core product of the Globe, which made most of the money, was the physical paper. And they were like, oh, we can save 30% by switching to this other company. And they, it was like a backroom thing that no one in the newsroom really knew about. But suddenly one day, like our entire Twitter mention feed was flooded with like, hey, where's my paper? Hey, where's my paper? We never got my paper today. And it turned out that 80% of the papers or some crazy number like that just hadn't gotten delivered that day because they'd done this logistics changeover. And like there were a bunch of those sort of like moments where the rest of the organization wasn't catching up. They were doing all this work on like paywall optimization that would inadvertently log people out of their subscriptions constantly. And so you'd have people who were like diehard readers of the Boston Globe who'd be like, every 5 minutes it logs me out. Like all I want to do is pay you money and read the paper. And I can't pay you money and read the paper. And that got into the newsroom pretty aggressively because it got to the point where the journalists were like, I go out to interview a source about a topic and like we talk about that thing. And then like the last 5 minutes of the conversation is like, hey, like, also, what the hell's going on with the Boston Globe? Like, I can't get on the website. My paper won't get delivered.
Were they owned by the New York Times at this point?
No, this is after John Henry had come in and done his thing to buy it.
Okay.
So this was partially that whole like rebuild of process. They were going through a whole thing where they're going to sell their presses. Like, it was really not the journalistic side that was failing, but like you saw journalists starting to change the way they covered types of stories. It was less thoughtful and it was less in depth. And there was, to be clear, there were still amazing journalists like working there. But like, like one of the most amazing data journalists I'd ever worked with, like she got fired because she was like pretty high up in the union, right? Yeah. Like it was like, oh, they're just layoffs. But like there were like two or three people who were like more junior and worse than her. And like there was a bunch of those sorts of things where it was like, I'd never really believed that whole idea of like, there's a real big divide between like different types of organizations, different types of departments within organizations. And this was like, oh, everyone has a fiefdom. Everyone is just trying to protect their fiefdom because they all know that like the revenue is going down, layoffs are coming. And that's what happened to me. Like 6 months later, I got laid off because it was like first in, first out, right?
Yeah,
and like,
right.
That's fine. That stuff happens. But it was a really interesting inside look at an organization that some people were trying to fix and other people were just sort of riding out. And that was fascinating to look at from the inside.
Yeah, I know that you said that you learned how institutions fail. And I wonder if that carried through to you in sort of like the Web3 kind of stuff that you had come onto. Was that sort of, do you think that lesson stuck with you and sort of made you more receptive to kind of the Web3 approach to some things?
I think so, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about this space and Web3 is like, there's a lot of failure in Web3, but it's very different kinds of failure. It's not usually organizational failure. It is either, or maybe it is organizational failure, right? This is kind of one of those things that's so strange about this space is that everything is always late and everything is always like, there's a great meme of like a beautifully, like the first third of a horse is beautifully drawn and the middle half is like not very well drawn and the back looks like a 2-year-old drew it. Yeah. And it's like Web3 product roadmaps, right? Where it's like the white paper is really awesome and then the shipped product doesn't live up to that. I think that is like one of the most fascinating things about this space is like we are organizing a global distributed community where not everyone works for the same thing to build these projects. And that's really hard. Mm-hmm. And like, I think there's been an underinvestment in this space in thinking about how you build that process in a way that doesn't involve centralization. And that's like a incredibly boring topic, right? In some ways, right? But like this is like the work that
but absolutely
the
central.
organizations. Yeah, I mean, like the Linux Foundation has done this pretty successfully, right? Linux is probably the most successful decentralized project that's ever existed.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that like Web3 could learn from the early open source community, I think.
Yeah. But then you have Torvald, who is just a complete maniac, right? Like,
Right, totally.
I've heard stories about him. Everybody has. But
right, and this is kind of like that. How do you like for a movement that is incredibly focused on decentralization? Why are we still falling victim to like the cult of the founder and the cult of personalities? Right, like Vitalik is not out there saying like I am the sole founder of Ethereum and the most important person in Ethereum. But everyone from users on Twitter to journalists to whatever, like Vitalik has a cult-like following. And like, I'm not sure he likes that. But it's very strange that for a decentralized movement, we're so quick to jump to like who's our Elon Musk, you know?
Yeah. I think it's really hard to be a leader, though. On the flip side of that, you know,
It is.
People don't. Yeah. I don't think tend to be leaders. They want to be followers, and maybe they don't want to, quote unquote. But that's just what tends to happen. I think it's a more natural progression. So
yeah,
that is one of the more interesting social kind of factors in this space. Is that you do have to kind of step up and be a leader, pretty much in every role you're engaging in. So I think that's off-putting for some people, and it makes us want to elevate somebody like Vitalik to that kind of hero status.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's all across the board, which is like the weird part. There's even like very crypto, and I'm not going to call it any specifics, but very crypto native conferences that are like, oh, we'll only let founders speak. Mm-hmm. And it's like, really? Still? Now?
Yeah. So now that we're on to crypto, like, how did you get into Bitcoin or you know, in college, or like, because that was sort of like where you were, that's kind of the timeline, right?
Yeah. So I bought some Bitcoin in like 2012 on like some super janky exchange and lost my keys like 6 months later. Yeah. And like, you know, now is it probably like 50 Bitcoin or something? Like it's probably pretty painful nowadays, right?
Yeah.
But like my initial, but that was the days when like PGP email encryption was like a huge pain to try and do. Like we just didn't have mental models for non-technical folks. Like I didn't go to school for engineering, you know, like or computer science or anything like that. Like I wasn't programming. I wasn't like private public key encryption was like super weird back in those days. Like, oh, which one do I have to keep private? Where do I store it? How does this whole thing work? So that was something that I was like, initially I dabbled in a bit. I didn't really get it. Kind of dropped out of the space for a while. And then in early 2017, I moved to New York and joined. I've been following crypto, but like pretty skeptically. And I joined a what turned out to be a failing fintech company that was trying to pivot into building a borrow lend token on Ethereum. Okay. And, you know, when your job depends on it, you just sit down and learn the damn thing, right? And so that's kind of like I was forced to sit down and read and learn about this stuff and like, okay, how do smart contracts work? Like, what can they actually be used for? All that sort of thing. That company ended up failing like 2 months after I joined. But I got really bit by the crypto bug at that point and started to really see how these technologies could improve the world. And, you know, decentralization for the point of decentralization is never something I've been into, but decentralization as a way of changing power dynamics, empowering different groups of people, creating systems that are harder to be captured, I think were really interesting ideas to me. And so, you know, after this company, you know, kind of shut down, I went to work for Republic, which is an offshoot of AngelList, running marketing for them and really help them build up and launch the Republic Crypto and Republic Crypto Services organization.
Kenneth Nguyen, right? Yeah, Kenneth Nguyen.
Yeah, Ken Nguyen, yeah.
Yeah. I talked to him a few times when I was at Bloomberg. He's a good guy.
Yeah. He's an incredibly dedicated founder who's just been like, honestly, by sheer force of will, for the first 3 years, he kept that organization alive. It had no, I don't want to say it had no business to like survive, but like, because right now Republic is it's a fantastic organization. They've been doing incredible things, but like those first 2 years when it was just doing equity crowdfunding, that was a really hard business to cut it in. And he, a weaker founder would not have been able to keep that thing through into the success that's been today.
Yeah, and just so listeners know, Republic allows kind of almost anybody to invest in companies that aren't necessarily public, right? And like not just an accredited investor. So it's more like a retail focused. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like AngelList is like the home for accredited investors to do this sort of thing. And Republic, you could put in, $20, $100, something like that into a private round of a company. And that was a really powerful new thing. And we did some cool work using debt instruments to actually do token pre-sales to non-accredited investors too on the crypto side of things. There were a lot of really innovative stuff that kind of got started there. And now Republic has a whole institutional side as well and a whole advisory services that they do. But it was a really cool place that was at the intersection of like investing and marketing and product and also like just the beginning of crypto.
Yeah.
For me.
Was there any project in particular that sort of the light bulb went off over your head, or you were talking about how it's expanding the capabilities of systems, but was there anything, specific that really appealed to you?
So I think some of the stuff I started to understand was around like when the governance conversations were starting to come up, like a dead-end idea that I don't think anyone ever took anywhere were token curated registries, but they were all kind of the rage in like 2018, which is basically the idea that you could have a registry where folks would buy tokens and stake their tokens to, and that could basically be a way of voting with monetary force. So the problem with like Yelp or Google or any of those review-based systems is they get botted all the time. And so the idea was like, what if you could have tokens and you attach those tokens to like, how good is this podcast? Well, I think it's quite good. I'm going to put some tokens against that, right? And it would be a way of basically having people stake reputation on the quality of whatever that thing was. There was ideas that was going to be used for drug development. It was going to be used for, restaurants, all that sorts of thing. And I think that was one of those ideas that got me thinking about it in the right way. And at the same time, NFTs, and not NFTs from an artwork perspective, but NFTs as the idea that this can represent some sort of digital access that is identified as being only one thing. So this is like before people were like, oh, NFTs are just going to be profile pictures. This is when it was like the way you log into your office workplace may be an NFT because those credentials can't be faked, right? There was lots of ideas about how NFTs could be used far outside of the art world and community world back then. And those were two things that really got me interested. There's a bunch of ideas for projects we did like the token sales of that I was like, I don't think this is going anywhere. One of them was a decentralized video streaming service, and I was like, I don't see the competitive reason this needs to be decentralized. Another was an Oracle solution. Lots of stuff like that just felt like it was either too early or just like a miss. But it got like learning about things you don't like is almost a better way to sometimes learn about the things that you actually might like.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've always thought, or I don't know what you think if you agree with this, but I think NFTs are like the first step towards a digital identity. That's been a really tough thing to solve in a decentralized, ecosystem, because the way we use it in the traditional world, of course, is like the DMV is like vouching for you, or the passport office, or it's some centralized authority. But it seems to me that an NFT could is a step in that direction for having some kind of digital identity that is verifiable and trusted.
Yeah, I agree. I think the idea that some trusted entity could issue an NFT that's transfer locked to my wallet that says this is a US person, they are an accredited investor, and they live in the state of New York. And that may be all the information that some KYC DeFi platform needs in order to accept me, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there. The challenge with any sort of on-chain identity has always been if, I personally can't see a way it doesn't become a massive ad tracking and surveillance network. Mm-hmm. And I've been looking at a bunch of architectures for decentralized identity, and I haven't yet seen a solution that to me feels like it isn't the ultimate surveillance tool. And maybe we'll get there someday, but
isn't the idea?
It seems.
I've had these conversations with folks too, and I don't quite get it myself, but the conversations I've had have sort of led me to think, well, you could have several different wallets, and this wallet is got no information, like I'm not giving anybody anything. And then this wallet's my medium wallet, and here's my, my more personal, like, is that idea kind of filtering through, do you think?
The trick is, like, I have a friend who worked in ad tech for 2 or 3 years, and the number of data sources that they would use to assemble a profile on who someone was included like IP address, like fragments of cookies from like 25 different websites. Like, the fact that like the NSA program only needed metadata to like figure out basically who you were in your entire life and like everyone you were talking to, and like that was actually more helpful in like unraveling like a network than actually the content of the phone calls. I think a lot of the people who are working on decentralized identity are very smart and they have a lot of great ideas, but they're underestimating the economic incentive to crack the identity behind any sort of obfuscation. Like even Apple's whole differential privacy thing that they were using, there were ad tracking engines that were actually looking at the way your specific iPhone, like the technical details, I don't like know exactly how this worked, but basically they could identify that your phone was using differential privacy, and they could use that as an additional way to track you. So the ad tech guys are really good, and they have they're sort of like they're equally as good as any of those like Russian troll farms that have like been like working to plant disinformation in all sorts of governments all around the world. Like they're really good at their jobs.
Yeah, it's like scammers. They're always one step ahead, or maybe two steps ahead.
Right? Yeah, we're always playing defense against someone who's trying to do something, and so I am basically concerned that the ad tech guys are too good.
I wonder if
and that decentralized identity is like a super cookie. Yeah, zero knowledge proofs are awesome. I think there's a ton of application there.
Yeah, maybe that could be a layer of protection for.
Totally, but then you run into like Tornado Cash and OFAC problems, right? So it's a very tricky system, I think, to make it work.
Yeah, I do
but I'm
too.
hopeful.
I don't think that is going to stand up in court, to be honest, because you can't ban code. Code is law, or code is speech, in my opinion. I think that's been already pretty well settled.
Yeah, I agree, but also like there's a ton of speech you can still get in trouble in court for.
Yeah,
like libel.
That is true, but that's not.
Yeah.
You can't ban the English language, just because it allows you to libel someone. So that's my feeling on what they did with the smart contracts with Tornado Cash.
Yes, I would agree.
So, okay, you're at Republic. You're helping on the crypto side. Take me from there. Like, what's next for you?
Yeah, got an offer to go join a really early stage blockchain infrastructure company. That seemed like a really exciting space to me. They were trying to basically make it so anyone could run a node on their laptop, their smart speaker, their connected TV, whatever. Spent a little bit of time there and then joined Bison Trails, which,
that's a
now is Coinbase
firm,
Cloud.
Right?
So Bison Trails was a like a premier blockchain infrastructure system that ran pretty much everything on various cloud providers. But their whole thing was they were the first truly enterprise grade blockchain infrastructure provider. So their theory was that like there were a lot of companies were spending a lot of money and time with an internal DevOps team that was running infrastructure to keep, Ledger was running a ton of infrastructure themselves. Binance was running a ton of infrastructure themselves. And some of these companies still do, but like it's very expensive to run all this blockchain infrastructure in-house because you need a bunch of different DevOps folks, and you basically need a business that like supports that massive scale. And so, Bison Trails was built by two founders who had already done successful companies before. They'd sold their first thing to Etsy. And they basically came in and said, like, we can build great blockchain infrastructure and we know how to build a company. And so Bison Trails was serving like trading firms, it was serving, exchanges, it was serving all sorts of different types of customers with really high performant, high reliability blockchain infrastructure. Basically, before then, everything that served the blockchain infrastructure market had been focused on cost. And this was the first company that was focused on reliability. And the thesis there is basically, if you are PayPal or you are Visa, you lose far more money from downtime than paying 3 times as much as you should for your infrastructure, right? Because they make all their money on order flow processing. And so if you can't process the orders, you can't make the money. And so something like a Coinbase was willing to pay 2 to 3 times more than a competitor might pay to be able to have someone you could page in 30 minutes and there would be an engineer who would wake up anytime and fix stuff. To have a hot spare system and fall over ready to go and have automated systems that switches that in. So that was a really cool place to work. I was there up until the acquisition by Coinbase. And that was a really cool place to look at, like, how do you build a software company that scales really quickly? That was sort of always a little bit targeted for acquisition. And it was very different than how you build like a long-term focused company as well.
Yeah.
But that was great because I got to work across, I was working on product marketing there, and I got to work across probably 20 different blockchain protocols. It was a really, really fantastic vantage point to see, you know, this was basically like 2020 roughly. To see a vantage point into all of these different protocols that we're developing and building and what the different architectural decisions were, what the different design decisions were. It's a guy, Victor Bunyan, who's still there at Coinbase Cloud now, but was like this protocol specialist. And his job was basically to like research all these protocols and figure out like what are the different ways that like we can build products and services to support them. And, you know, like that work that he was doing there that would then turn into a lot of the stuff I was like building materials off of for product marketing and helping the product team figure out like, how do we build something for this thing? It was just an incredible exposure into the space. And that was the thing that like changed me from being like, I want to work in companies that are working in blockchain to I want to go work for an actual protocol, right? Like working for Bison Trails or working for an investment group, you're not working in blockchain, you're working around blockchain.
Yeah, adjacent to
right?
it.
Like you're basically working for a Web 2.5 company, and I really wanted to go work for a proper Web 3 company.
What? So I'm curious if those 20 protocols are still around, all of them, or if have some gone by the wayside. And
almost all of them are still around. Yeah, it was like Polkadot, NuCypher, Keep, which actually merged, which was pretty interesting. I did a bunch of work on the ETH2 infrastructure and the ETH2 products and services in the lead up to the Beacon Chain launch back in 2020. All that kind of stuff. A bunch of work with Near. Funny enough, like Bison Trails did support Solana, but like I never had any conversation with anyone at Solana until after I left.
Oh, wow. That's funny.
Yeah.
So I think Coinbase comes in, buys Bison Trails, and that's kind of it for you there, right? That was...
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where it was like, I don't think I would have done well at an organization as large as Coinbase that has that many layers of sort of process and bureaucracy and, something you have to do if you're running an organization that big. But like, it just probably wouldn't have been a good fit for me.
Yeah. So if you've made this decision that you want to work for a blockchain, like how does one go about that? What did you do next to try to make that a reality?
Well, I knew a bunch of people who worked for all these different blockchain organizations because of my work at Bison Trails. And so some of it was just reaching out to them and being like, hey, like, here's what I do. Here's what I've done. I'd love to go work for a proper like Web3 company. Well, we didn't call it Web3 back then, but, a proper blockchain. Yeah. Right. And, I was reaching out to a few folks who I'd used to work with or something. And I reached out to a guy, Ben Sparango, who used to work at Republic. He was actually there for, I think, so I had to hire him. I think he worked for us for like 3 weeks. Then he quit for a better job. But, I was like, hey, do you know of anything interesting in this space? He's like, actually, I just joined Solana Labs. And also Jed, who was was one of the lawyers at Republic, had just joined to be the general counsel of Solana Labs. And they were like, you should totally come in and talk to us. Like, let's get you on a call with Raj and Anatoly. Like, I think this is a really cool place to work. And at the same time, like, I think your skill set would be really helpful for what we're trying to do here. And I was like, I don't know, I've been working with 20 different blockchain protocols for the last year. Like, I haven't worked with anyone from Solana, but like, yeah, I'll take the call, right?
Yeah.
And, I think it was like 30 hours from like first call to offer letter. Like, I think that getting on a call with these folks who are now my colleagues here and chatting with them about, and with Raj and Anatoly about like system architecture design, like in my experience working on ETH2, back when we still called it ETH2, there's a lot of questions I had about like, how does DeFi work in a sharded environment? Like, aren't we going to have a lot of fractured state going on? How does that affect liquidity? All these different types of things. And the answer from like, Anatoly and Raj was like, this is why Solana is built in one global state, that we think a lot of these problems, step 1 is to make the base chain as fast as humanly possible. Step 4 is sharding, right? Like that should be like the last thing that you try and do when you're trying to scale a blockchain. And that's a pretty bold philosophy. It was a zag while the rest of the market was zigging. But it was one that they were willing to take. And, for me, I was like, look, even if this thing goes nowhere, these are incredibly smart people. I'm going to learn a ton. But I also thought the architecture was probably the right approach.
Yeah. And just for listeners, Solana is incredibly fast. I think it's 50,000 transactions per second. And these are the latest numbers I've seen. And the cost is very low. It's far below a penny per transaction. Whereas Ethereum is somewhere around 14 transactions per second, and the cost varies depending on the demand on the network. But Austin, can you kind of just walk us through, like, what is that architecture? How did Solana achieve that 50,000 per second transaction rate kind of out of the box?
Yeah, so all these transaction numbers you get from pretty much every modern network, they're all estimations based on like various types of use. So a more complicated transaction, will take more compute units. And so, that 50,000 number is one of those numbers that's like, if it's all simple transactions, you're about that big. Basically, you think about it as like a compute budget, which is like how much compute unit can be done in 1 second on the network. And so for Solana, it runs on a pretty different architecture. So one of the major things was getting rid of the Ethereum virtual machine engine and building a new engine, a new virtual machine underneath that. And then using this thing called proof of history, which is not a consensus mechanism, but it's a giant distributed clock that each of the validators runs. And so every transaction that comes in is it's not exactly a timestamp, but it's functionally timestamped. And so what that means is that the network can process things that are not overlapping in parallel, which is a really big change. So on Ethereum, everything is done in order. Even if one of those transactions is that, I'm going to send you $1 and then, 2 of our friends are also going to send each other $1. Those transactions can actually execute in parallel because there's nothing overlapping between them. In Ethereum, it's all in order, right? Which is like it was the first smart contract blockchain. Like it was incredibly innovative for the space. But by introducing parallelism into this runtime, Solana can be much faster for non-overlapping transactions. And because the runtime itself is built just on a different subsystem, its sort of in-order processing can still be much faster. And so these are just some technological architecture changes that make the network scalable and much faster. It doesn't rely on sharding. And kind of the analogy with sharding is like, it's basically like you can take a highway and if you want to pump more cars through it, you can either add more lanes or you can make all the cars drive faster, right? And the Solana approach is basically like, the first thing we need to do is make the cars all go at 500 miles an hour, right? Because when you start creating like a 16-lane highway, moving from one lane to the other lane to actually get to the exit ramp you want to get to is cumbersome and it takes time. And it's like that whole process of switching lanes, like that is basically inter-shard communication on other network architectures. So there's risk involved, there's time delays involved, there's validation involved to make all of that interconnective fiber within a network run. And so Solana is basically built on a more simple paradigm that we should make the base layer as fast as humanly possible before looking at any of those other solutions to create scale.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There have been some hiccups though along the way and some problems. Like the network has gone down several times. There's been some hacks. I mean, there's hacks everywhere. But how do you? I mean, obviously decentralization is very important, as we've been discussing with to you, and like it's a core kind of belief I think that you have. It I think rubs some people the wrong way when you can see like, oh, Solana just turned its blockchain off and then turned it back on.
So I do want to kind of correct that because there is no ability for anyone to turn Solana off and back on. So that's like this is the thing that like pops up every once in a while where like people think there's an off button that was hit or something along those lines. What happens in all those situations is, for lack of a better term, the blockchain crashes, right? The same way that any other software system could crash. It gets into a state where it can't resolve itself, right? It can't make forward progress without the intervention of the humans that run all these validators all around the world. So basically, the network gets to a decision point where it says, like, its internal software can't say which of these two options is correct.
Right.
And
like
so that's
a
where manual
validator
intervention
could be making 2 blocks, right, per transaction.
You
don't know which one is the real record.
Sure, it could be a forking incident, could be due to a bug in the code, whatever the reason is. It's not like someone turns the network off. The network turns itself off, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And then it takes human intervention to restart it. And this is not something specific to Solana. This happened to Ethereum 2 in the Ethereum 2 testnet, where all the validators had to do a coordinated restart of it. But the reliability of Solana is the highest priority for the engineering teams who are working on kind of solving these problems. And part of this comes from the network's 2.5 years old, right? The mainnet beta launched in March of 2020. And since then, there's been such an astronomical user growth that a lot of systems just have not been battle tested sufficiently enough. And some of that battle testing happens in production. And so there's a lot of work being done right now on new network components. You can go to solana.com/upgrades and you can see some of what that work actually looks like. But the number one thing that the core engineering team and all the global team of contributors are working on is increasing that reliability, because that is, I would say, the biggest knock against the network, and lots of it is a fair criticism. That I would say that the part that's interesting is we're not really seeing the network when it goes down. It's not going down for the same reason, right? It's going down for edge cases that are being found, which should be found before they're done in prod, but there is progress being made there, is the thing I would say.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about blockchain, and everything's in public. Like failures are entirely public, and successes are public, and it's all right there for everyone to see, for good and for bad. I'm just curious, like the parallelism that you were describing that makes it so fast. Does that have an effect on sometimes where the network gets, in trouble? Is that a trade-off that was made, or are those totally separate things?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been, I think there's been one situation where that parallelism created a fault that basically like a bug that was not previously known was triggered, and that's kind of one of the issues that caused one of the network outages. But there's a few things to sort of note about outages. And the first is that they're not actually a function of centralization or decentralization. The decentralization of a network isn't really impacted through an outage. And the other piece is that the state of Solana, right, the actual account ledger and database, from its perspective, when the network goes down, there was just a really long block. There's just like a 7-hour block as opposed to a 400 millisecond block. So obviously it's bad for users. It's bad for, the user experience of using the network. But from a technical standpoint, from a safety standpoint, the state of the network is never at risk, right? Which is different than the architecture of some other networks. There are other networks out there where if the network can't reconcile, it actually just keeps going and does something called a block reorg, where they basically go back and rewrite history and say, we thought this thing happened, but actually after reconciling a bunch more data, this other thing happened. And so that is unwinding transaction history and rewriting the past. And the Solana network, when it gets into a situation where it thinks it might have to do something like that, it halts, which you can argue is a better or a worse system architecture design, but it is an intentional design difference to say that if the network can't be 100% sure of what's supposed to happen, it should stop and it should rely on basically social consensus to figure out what the right answer is here.
Yeah, I definitely kind of fall in that camp. I'd rather have it stop and pause than have to reorganize the history, because that's the whole kind of point of blockchain, is that history is sacrosanct.
Yes.
Do you see a future where there are just different chains all operating, in the same space? Or do you think is there going to be a convergence, or is there going to be a winner, or how do you look out 5 or 10 years in terms of the different L1s that are out there like Ethereum and Solana,
Yeah.
and that?
So I think a lot of this depends on what the kind of companies are that end up adopting these systems. So one of the ecosystems I think is pretty interesting to look at is Cosmos, because Cosmos is built on sort of a more like application specific chain architecture. So if you are like a gaming company, right, you can make a really strong argument that you actually want to build on a global open public blockchain like Solana. You could also make an argument that in order to capture the value and to retain control of as much as possible, you should build on an application specific sidechain. And so you're seeing actually a real divergence right now. There are some Web 2 companies that are starting to build on Web 3 and they say, we want to be part of the whole ecosystem. We're fully in. We're ready to like eat our existing business model and disrupt ourselves and move on to this new thing. There are other companies that say like, we're kind of still experimenting and we're not really sure if this is going to be the future, but we know we have to experiment with it. And we want to do that in a situation where we have more centralized control over what happens. And so that's where you see those folks choosing something like a Cosmos architecture to build on. And one of the fascinating things about the Ethereum transition is the future of Ethereum post-Surge, when they add all the shards and everything like that, it's going to look a lot more like Cosmos than it looks like Ethereum today. And that's a really interesting dynamic in the market. I think there's definitely room for a multi-chain future, but I think what we're going to see is a greater and greater divergence between stuff that's built to be public and open and like Web3 native, and a lot of these Web 2 companies coming over and kind of building something that looks a little bit more like Web 2.5.
Yeah, and I mean, coming from a financial background, that's a lot of banks and financial companies are trying to experiment with blockchain, but they want it to be enterprise grade. They want it to be a closed chain, not public, for various reasons. And I've always thought,
and you can argue they should.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like if you're Bank of America and you're trying to figure out like how do I build something on blockchain, you probably still want a lot of centralized control over that, but you want the connective fiber to be able to plug into the rest of the DeFi ecosystem. But also you want the ability to like turn your network off if like you feel like something bad is happening on it or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And then you also have the DeFi founders who are like, we want to replace the banks and we want to build it fully permissionless, fully open, fully on chain. And we're going to I think I'm excited for a world where both of those paradigms can coexist.
Yeah. Well, Austin, this has been great. I really appreciate talking to me. And why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and how they could learn more about Solana?
So Solana.com is the best place to learn about the network. There's Solana.com/developers if you're interested in getting started building. For me, Twitter is the best place. I'm Austin_Federa on Twitter.
That's excellent. All right. Well, again, thank you very much, Austin. I really appreciated the conversation, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. This was great.
That's it for this episode of Decent People. Thanks so much for listening. Check the show notes for more information on our guests today. And make sure to look us up on the web at Decential.io. That's DECENTIAL.io. And on Twitter at Decential. Have a great day.